The financial independence and retire early community is largely built around the 4% rule, which states that you need 25 times your annual expenses to be financially free. But it's controversial. The Trinity Study, from which the 4% rule was derived, only considered 30-year retirements. Early retirements could be much longer than that. And if the 4% rule fails, millions of people's retirements could be at stake. So, will it? I'm the fireman, and I'm broadcasting my journey to financial freedom. But an important question is, how much money would I even need to call myself financially independent? Well, the common answer is 25 times your annual expenses. This is known as the 4% rule. It's a result derived from the Trinity Study, which found that a 4% withdrawal rate was safe in 95% of historical retirements. The result from the Trinity Study is commonly repeated, but there have been several credible arguments that the 4% rule isn't nearly as safe as a lot of people think. And that's a big deal because a lot of people's retirements depend on it. Is it safe to bet your financial freedom on the 4% rule? Well, maybe. Let's go over some of the arguments that I've seen the most, and we'll see what makes sense and what doesn't. The first concern around the 4% rule is the time frame. After all, the original Trinity study only considered 30-year retirements. Now, 30 years might sound like a long time, but it's not long enough. If I did actually retire at 30 years old, I might be looking at a retirement that is twice that length. That becomes a big issue for the early retirement community, where a lot of people are looking at longer retirements than is standard. So, will the 4% rule fall apart? Well, luckily, all of the data needed to repeat the Trinity study is publicly available, and the financial independence blog, thepoorswiss.com, actually ran the numbers for longer retirements. So, what are the results? What he found is that, yes, the 4% rule is riskier for 40 and 50-year retirements. For example, using a portfolio of 75% stocks and 25% bonds, the success rate of a 4% withdrawal rate dropped from 95% for a 30-year retirement to closer to 85% for a 50-year retirement. That might be a little riskier than you like, and retirements aren't something that should be gambled with. To get back to a 95% success rate for these longer retirements, you'd need to use a 3.5% withdrawal rate instead. While the 4% rule is riskier for longer retirements, another important result is that in the majority of cases, most portfolios increase by a lot. For example, after 40 years of following the 4% rule, the average portfolio is almost 20 times its starting value. Some fail, but most thrive. So, longer retirements are indeed riskier. To compensate, a lower withdrawal rate, like 3.5%, might be advisable, especially if you have no plans to earn any income in retirement. But either way, in most cases, people become much wealthier in retirement. Another criticism of the 4% rule is that it doesn't take into account taxes. But this is only half true. Since taxes are different everywhere, it is true that they aren't factored into the Trinity study explicitly. But that said, if taxes are just treated as another expense, they shouldn't make a big difference on whether the 4% rule works or not. Let's also not forget that if you do retire early, the amount of taxes you pay could change drastically. I mean, I'm paying about $30,000 a year in taxes right now, but most of that is income tax. If I retired early, that would change. Unless a bunch of you like and subscribe to this YouTube channel, my only income would be my investment returns. I wouldn't be withdrawing more than I need, and taxes on investment returns are, at least right now, much lower than they are on regular income. And another important consideration could be whether you plan to move or not. Right now, I live near Washington, D.C., which is insanely expensive. But if I do decide to retire as fast as possible, I would definitely move to a cheaper area. Doing that could obviously make a big difference on your annual expenses, but it could also change your tax situation. So, if you're doing this calculation for yourself, make sure you're using your post retirement circumstances. As long as you factor these numbers into your retirement calculations, taxes shouldn't be a deal breaker when it comes to the 4% rule. Another common concern is about big, unexpected expenses. See, the Trinity study assumes a constant withdrawal rate, 4% of the initial portfolio value, and then just adjusted for inflation in years after. But what if expenses increase for reasons other than inflation? Could big, unexpected expenses disrupt your retirement strategy? My answer is not if you have good planning. For one, I would never retire without an emergency reserve, which could cushion a few bad surprises. On top of that, I would make sure that within my annual expenses budget, I had enough cushion that I could fill up this emergency reserve over time. Uncertainty should be part of your planning. And another important way to mitigate this risk is to transfer it to somebody else. Love them or hate them, insurance companies exist for a reason. Insurance companies are there to absorb risk that you can't. Of course, they'll charge a fee for their services, but if you can't afford to lose something without having to go back to work, then maybe it should be insured. That could be house insurance or car insurance, and, at least in America, medical insurance. You may never need it, but insurance is an important safety net. A related concern is with old age. After all, how you spend your money will likely change over the course of your retirement. Will the 4% rule, and your retirement with it, implode just as you reach your later years? Well, that's hard to answer because everybody is different, but there are still a few points that I think are important to make. First off, the Trinity Study doesn't take into account any safety nets or anything like that. Social Security, pensions, and the benefits of tax advantaged accounts are completely unaccounted for. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of accounts end up with much more money than they started with. So that means, despite retiring early, you might actually reach old age with a lot more money than you think. So, while it's difficult to predict decades from now, most adherents to the 4% rule have ended up actually becoming much wealthier. And, of course, there is insurance again. Especially for medical costs in America, insurance will be an important component. So, between all of these strategies, I'm not super stressed about old age. Let's move on to the next criticism of the 4% rule. And this is actually a criticism of all investment projections. See, the 4% rule is derived from historical data. So, how do we know whether it will keep working? It's a fair point. Predicting the stock market is notoriously difficult, and past returns are no guarantee of the future. But personally, I'm not that worried about this. And that's not because I have some crystal ball telling me what the stock market will return this year or the next. Maybe the average returns will be higher, or maybe they'll be lower. But as long as humans are able to keep innovating and growing, money will keep making money. That's a bet I'm willing to take. I have faith that the market will grow just as it has in the last 150 years. So, personally, I'm pretty comfortable with the 4% rule. Then again, that's also because I'm willing to move to cheaper places and will also likely continue to earn at least some money once I'm in retirement. And even so, I likely will actually save more than 25 times my annual expenses before I call it quits. If you want to play it safer, you might want to as well. Either way, the 4% rule is just a rule of thumb. It makes no promises about the future, but it might serve as a helpful guiding light. And one last thing before you go. See, the 4% rule only works if you invest wisely. That's why I recently went through an interview with one of the most successful investors ever, who turned $70,000 into $58 million. You can find that video right here, where we talk about how he did it and the investing advice he gives to others. So, if you're trying to speed up your journey to financial freedom through investing, check that video out next, and I'll see you next time.